You spend countless hours trying to motivate your team, your family, even yourself, yet nothing seems to stick beyond temporary compliance. Every attempt to inspire action feels like you're pushing against an invisible wall, watching people nod politely before returning to their old habits the moment you turn away. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades discovering why some people can inspire others to move mountains, while most of us struggle to get anyone to take a single step. Through training millions of people and witnessing both spectacular failures and remarkable transformations, I learned that the difference between manipulation and genuine motivation isn't in what you say, it's in why people choose to listen. What I'm about to share will transform how you inspire action in every relationship, whether you're leading a team, raising children, or trying to motivate yourself to reach new heights. The principles I developed don't just create temporary compliance, they build lasting enthusiasm that comes from within. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for authentic motivation has spread around the world. Growing up on our Missouri farm, I learned early that if you wanted something done, you pushed until it happened. When our mule wouldn't move, you used the whip. When the plow hit hard ground, you forced it through. This approach seemed to work. With animals and machinery so naturally, I assumed it would work with people too. I was devastatingly wrong. My first real lesson came when I started selling correspondence courses for the international correspondence schools. I was young, eager, and absolutely convinced that if I could just present the facts forcefully enough, people would have to buy. I developed what I thought was a foolproof system: identify the prospect's weakness, apply pressure to that weak point, and don't let up until they signed on the dotted line. I remember my first major sales call with vivid, painful clarity. The buy prospect was a railroad worker named Jim Morrison, who clearly needed better skills to advance his career. I cornered him in his modest living room and began my assault. I told him bluntly that he was wasting his life in a dead-end job. I painted dire pictures of his future poverty if he didn't act immediately. I pressured his wife about wanting better for their children. I used every manipulative trick I'd learned or invented. The more resistance I encountered, the harder I pushed. When Jim hesitated about the cost, I told him he couldn't afford not to buy. When he wanted to think it over, I insisted that opportunity wouldn't wait. When his wife looked uncomfortable, I implied they were being foolish and short-sighted. By the end of that evening, I had browbeaten them into submission. They signed the contract with reluctant, resentful expressions. I walked away feeling triumphant, convinced I had mastered the art of persuasion. 3 days later, Jim Morrison canceled his enrollment and demanded his deposit back. When I showed up at his door to object, he looked me straight in the eye and said something I'll never forget. "Son, you didn't sell me anything. You just made me feel small and stupid until I gave in to make you go away. That's not selling. That's bullying." His words hit me like a physical blow because I recognized the truth in them immediately. I had indeed been a bully, using psychological pressure and manipulation to force compliance. I hadn't created genuine desire or motivation. I had simply worn someone down until resistance felt more exhausting than surrender. This pattern repeated itself over and over in those early years. I would use high-pressure tactics to force immediate decisions, only to face cancellations, complaints, and a growing reputation as someone people crossed the street to avoid. I was creating temporary compliance through coercion, but I was also creating lasting resentment and resistance. The turning point came when I realized that every person I had successfully pressured into buying eventually found a way to back out, complain, or simply refuse to engage with me again. Meanwhile, the few sales that stuck were the ones where people had convinced themselves they wanted what I was offering. Those customers became enthusiastic advocates, referring friends and asking for additional services. Slowly, painfully, I began to understand that there was a fundamental difference between forcing someone to do something and inspiring them to want to do it. Force created resistance. Inspiration created momentum. Manipulation might win the battle, but it always lost the war. This realization set me on a completely different path, one that would eventually lead to discovering the true principles of motivation without manipulation. Everything changed for me in 1912 when I began teaching public speaking classes at the YMCA in New York City. I had moved there with little more than hope and determination, taking the teaching position because I desperately needed the income. What I discovered in that humble classroom would revolutionize my understanding of human motivation forever. My students were working men and women who came to class after long days at factories, offices, and shops. They paid their hard-earned money to learn something that terrified most of them, speaking in front of others. I expected to teach them techniques and tactics, but instead they taught me the most profound lesson of my career. During my first few sessions, I fell back on my old approach. I tried to push students to overcome their fear through sheer force of will. "Just get up there and speak," I would command. "Stop being afraid." I used the same bullying tactics that had failed me in sales, thinking that somehow classroom authority would make them more effective. The results were predictably disastrous. Students became more nervous, not less. Some stopped coming altogether. Those who remained looked miserable and performed poorly. I was creating exactly the opposite of what I intended. Instead of inspiring confidence, I was reinforcing their fears and inadequacies. Then something remarkable happened that opened my eyes completely. One evening, a shy bookkeeper named William stood to give his practice speech. He had been struggling for weeks, barely able to speak above a whisper when called upon, but this particular night he chose to talk about his young son, who was battling a serious illness. As William described his daily visits to the hospital and his hopes for his boy's recovery, something magical occurred. His voice grew stronger. His posture straightened. His eyes lit up with genuine emotion. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes with more passion and eloquence than I had heard from students who had been training for months. When he finished, the entire class erupted in spontaneous applause. After class, I pulled William aside. "What was different tonight?" I asked. "How did you suddenly become such a powerful speaker?" His answer changed everything for me. "Mr. Carnegie, I forgot about being afraid because I was so focused on something that mattered to me. I wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. I just wanted to share something important." In that moment, I realized I had been approaching motivation completely backwards. Instead of trying to eliminate what people were afraid of, I needed to help them connect with what they cared about. Instead of pushing them past their resistance, I needed to help them find their own reasons for moving forward. I began experimenting with this insight immediately. Rather than demanding that students overcome their fear, I started asking them to talk about subjects they were passionate about. Instead of criticizing their nervousness, I helped them focus on their message and their desire to share it. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Students who had been paralyzed by fear began speaking with natural confidence when they talked about their children, their hobbies, their work experiences, or their dreams. They weren't conquering fear through force, they were transcending it through genuine motivation. I watched this pattern repeat itself dozens of times. A timid housewife became eloquent when describing her volunteer work with orphans. A gruff factory worker spoke with poetry when talking about his garden. A nervous accountant commanded the room when explaining his ideas for improving business efficiency. Each time, the same principle was at work. People found their natural motivation when they connected with something that mattered deeply to them. They didn't need to be pushed, pulled, or manipulated. They needed to be helped to recognize and tap into their own internal drive. This revelation extended far beyond public speaking. I began to see that all human motivation worked the same way. People didn't need external pressure to perform at their best. They needed to connect their actions with their internal values, desires, and purposes. The students at the YMCA had taught me that motivation isn't something you do to people, it's something you help them discover within themselves. This insight became the foundation for everything I would later teach about human relations and influence. My revelation at the YMCA launched me into years of intensive study about what truly drives human behavior. I became fascinated by a simple but profound question. Why do some people seem naturally motivated while others appear chronically unmotivated? The answer I discovered would challenge everything most people believe about influence and persuasion. I began by observing successful people in every field I could access. I spent time with business leaders, artists, athletes, teachers, and reformers. I interviewed hundreds of individuals who seemed to possess an almost magnetic ability to inspire others. What I found surprised me completely. The most influential people rarely tried to motivate others directly. Instead, they had mastered the art of helping people motivate themselves. They understood a fundamental principle that most people miss entirely. Every person is already motivated. The key is discovering what motivates them and aligning that natural drive with the desired outcome. During my research, I had the privilege of spending several afternoons with Henry Ford in Dearborn. Ford had revolutionized manufacturing not just through assembly lines, but through his understanding of worker motivation. When I asked him how he managed to get such extraordinary productivity from his employees, his answer was illuminating. "Carnegie," he said, "most managers think workers are lazy and need to be pushed. That's nonsense. Every man who walks through those factory doors is highly motivated to feed his family, to feel proud of his work, to be respected by his peers, to build something meaningful. My job isn't to motivate them. My job is to create conditions where their existing motivation can flow toward our shared goals." Ford then shared something that became one of my core insights. People don't resist work. They resist having their personal motivations ignored or suppressed. When you can connect what needs to be done with what they already want to accomplish, resistance disappears and enthusiasm takes its place. This led me to understand the crucial difference between compliance and commitment. Compliance is what you get when you apply external pressure. People do what you want because they feel they have no choice. Commitment is what you get when people's internal motivations align with the desired action. They do what you want because they genuinely want to do it. I began to see this pattern everywhere. Children who were unmotivated in subjects that bored them became passionate learners when those same subjects connected to their interests. Employees who seemed lazy in meaningless tasks worked tirelessly when they understood how their work contributed to something they valued. Even I discovered that activities I had always considered tedious became energizing when I connected them to my larger purposes. The science behind this became clearer as I delved deeper into psychology. I learned that every human being has certain fundamental needs that drive their behavior: the need to feel important, the need to be appreciated, the need to belong, the need for security, the need for growth, and the need for meaning. These aren't wants or preferences. They're psychological necessities, as real as the need for food or shelter. When people's actions fulfill these basic needs, they feel naturally motivated. When their actions conflict with these needs or ignore them entirely, they feel resistance, even if they can't articulate why. This explained why manipulation techniques might create temporary compliance, but always failed in the long run. They worked against people's fundamental psychological needs rather than with them. I discovered that successful motivation always follows the same pattern. First, you must understand what genuinely matters to the other person. Second, you must find authentic ways to connect your request or proposal with their existing desires and values. Third, you must present the connection in a way that helps them see the alignment clearly. This isn't manipulation because you're not creating false desires or using deception. You're simply helping people recognize how achieving your goal can also achieve theirs. When this alignment is genuine, both parties benefit. and the motivation becomes self-sustaining. The more I studied this phenomenon, the more I realized that most people approach influence backwards. They start with what they want and then try to convince others to want it too. But successful motivation starts with understanding what others already want and then finding genuine ways to help them achieve it through the action you're hoping to inspire. This insight transformed not just my teaching, but my entire approach to human relations. I stopped trying to change people's motivations and started learning to work with them. Of all the fundamental human needs I discovered, none proved more powerful than the deep universal craving to feel important and valued. This isn't vanity or selfishness. It's a basic psychological requirement that, when fulfilled, unleashes tremendous motivation and energy in people. I learned this lesson through a painful personal experience that became one of my most valuable teaching tools. Early in my career, I was invited to speak at a business conference in Chicago. I was young, ambitious, and, frankly, quite full of myself. During the reception before my presentation, I was introduced to an elderly janitor named Sam who had worked at the hotel for over 30 years. Instead of taking a moment to acknowledge him properly, I barely glanced in his direction, muttered a distracted "hello," and immediately turned my attention to more important people in the room. My presentation that evening went poorly. The microphone malfunctioned, the slide projector broke down, and the room was uncomfortably warm. Everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong. I left feeling frustrated and wondering what had happened. The next morning, I discovered that Sam wasn't just a janitor. He was the man responsible for all the technical equipment in the conference rooms. He had been working there for 3 decades and knew every wire, every switch, and every potential problem in that building. Had I taken 30 seconds to acknowledge him as a person, to show genuine interest in his work and experience, my presentation would likely have gone flawlessly. But more importantly, I realized I had missed an opportunity to make another human being feel valued and important. Sam had a lifetime of stories, experiences, and wisdom that I had dismissed without a thought. In my arrogance, I had treated him as invisible, and in doing so, I had diminished both of us. This experience taught me to pay attention to how making people feel important or unimportant affected their willingness to help, support, and go the extra mile. The results were remarkable and consistent. When I began genuinely acknowledging people's contributions, asking about their experiences, and showing authentic interest in their perspectives, their response was transformational. They didn't just become more willing to help me. They became more motivated in everything they did. I saw this principle work with everyone from corporate executives to hotel maids. A simple acknowledgement of someone's expertise, a sincere question about their work, or honest appreciation for their contribution seemed to unlock energy and enthusiasm that hadn't been there before. But I had to learn the crucial difference between genuine appreciation and empty flattery. Flattery is about getting something from someone. Appreciation is about recognizing something valuable in someone. People can sense this difference immediately, even if they can't articulate it. Remember working with a department manager named Helen, who was struggling with her team's performance. Her employees seemed disengaged and were doing only the minimum required. When I observed Helen's interactions with her staff, I noticed she rarely acknowledged their work except to point out problems or areas for improvement. I suggested she try a different approach. Look for specific things her team members were doing well and acknowledge those contributions explicitly. Not generic praise like "good job," but specific recognition like, "Sarah, I noticed how you handled that difficult customer call yesterday. Your patience and creativity in finding a solution really impressed me." The change in her team was dramatic. Employees who had seemed unmotivated began taking initiative. People started staying late to finish projects they cared about. The entire atmosphere of the department shifted from resignation to enthusiasm. Helen later told me, "I had no idea how much people needed to feel that their work mattered." I was so focused on fixing problems that I forgot to acknowledge what was working well. This taught me that making people feel important isn't just about being nice. It's about recognizing and nurturing the human need for significance. When people feel that their contributions matter, that their efforts are seen and valued, that their perspective has worth, they naturally want to contribute more. I discovered that there are countless ways to make people feel important. Asking for their opinion on matters within their expertise, remembering details about their interests and lives, acknowledging their contributions publicly, giving them opportunities to share their knowledge with others, and simply listening to them with genuine attention and respect. The key is authenticity. People can immediately sense whether your acknowledgement is genuine or manipulative. When you truly see value in others and express that recognition honestly, you tap into one of the most powerful motivational forces in human nature. Making others feel important doesn't diminish your own importance. It multiplies it. People are naturally drawn to and motivated by those who recognize their worth. One of the most difficult lessons I had to learn was this. People are fundamentally interested in themselves and their own problems, not in you and your problems. This isn't selfishness, it's human nature. Once I truly understood and accepted this principle, my ability to motivate others increased dramatically. For years, I made the classic mistake of approaching people with my own agenda front and center. I would walk into meetings thinking about what I needed, what I wanted to accomplish, what would benefit me or my organization. I presented proposals in terms of why they mattered to me, not why they should matter to the other person. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging situation with a client named Robert Patterson, who owned a small manufacturing company. I had been trying for months to convince him to invest in training programs for his supervisors. Every time I met with him, I talked about the excellent reputation of our training, the credentials of our instructors, and the success we'd had. With other companies, Patterson listened politely but never committed. He would nod, ask a few questions, and then say he needed to think it over. This went on for months, and I was becoming increasingly frustrated. Then, one day, during what I expected to be another fruitless meeting, Patterson mentioned that he was losing his best workers to competitors who offered better advancement opportunities. He was clearly worried about this trend, but didn't see how to address it without significantly increasing wages, which he couldn't afford. Instead of launching into my usual presentation about our training programs, I stopped and really listened. I asked questions about his specific situation. What kinds of workers was he losing? What did they say when they left? What advancement opportunities were his competitors offering that he wasn't? As Patterson talked, I began to see the connection between his problem and what I was offering, but this time from his perspective, not mine. His workers weren't leaving just for more money, they were leaving for better career prospects. They wanted to develop skills and advance their careers. My training programs could provide exactly that, but instead of talking about our programs, I talked about his workers. "Mr. Patterson," I said, "what if you could offer your best employees something that would make them more valuable, more skilled, and more loyal to your company? What if you could create advancement opportunities without having to promote people before they're ready?" Now I had his complete attention. I wasn't selling training anymore. I was offering a solution to his specific problem. I showed him how investing in his workers' development would make them more capable, more satisfied, and less likely to leave. I explained how trained supervisors could identify and develop other potential leaders within his company. Every benefit I described was presented in terms of what it would do for him and his business, not in terms of what it would do for my training company. The result? Patterson signed up for the most comprehensive training package we offered and became one of our most enthusiastic advocates. This experience taught me that successful motivation always flows through the channel of self-interest. This doesn't mean people are selfish. It means they're human. Everyone is dealing with their own challenges, pursuing their own goals, and trying to solve their own problems. If you can genuinely help them do these things, they'll be motivated to work with you. The key is to understand what people really want, not what you think they should want. I learned to spend much more time listening and asking questions before presenting any ideas or proposals. I discovered that people will tell you exactly how to motivate them if you just pay attention to what they're saying. Sometimes their self-interest is financial. They want to make more money or save money. Sometimes it's professional. They want advancement, recognition, or skill development. Sometimes it's personal. They want more time with family, less stress, or greater security. Sometimes it's social. They want to help others, make a difference, or be part of something meaningful. The most effective approach is to genuinely understand these interests and then find authentic ways to align your proposals with what they already want to achieve. This isn't manipulation because you're not creating false desires. You're helping people recognize how your suggestion can help them accomplish their existing goals. I also learned that self-interest often extends beyond immediate personal gain. Many people are motivated by the impact their actions will have on their families, their communities, or their legacy. Understanding these broader interests often provides even more powerful motivation than focusing only on immediate personal benefits. The principle works in reverse too. When you ignore people's self-interest or ask them to act against it, resistance is inevitable. Even if people comply temporarily, they'll resent it and look for ways to avoid similar situations in the future. Speaking to people's self-interest isn't about becoming calculating or manipulative. It's about becoming genuinely helpful. When you consistently help others achieve what they want, they naturally want to help you achieve what you want. I discovered one of the most powerful motivation techniques quite by accident, while observing my own resistance to being told what to do. Even when the instruction was reasonable and beneficial, something inside me automatically resisted when someone issued a direct command. This resistance seemed to be a fundamental human trait. The revelation came while working with a particularly challenging client, a brilliant but stubborn executive named Thomas Wheeler, who seemed to reject every suggestion I made. No matter how logical my recommendations were, Wheeler would find reasons to argue or delay implementation. Our sessions were becoming exercises in futility. One day, instead of telling Wheeler what he should do, I found myself asking him a series of questions about his situation. "What do you think would happen if your team had clearer communication protocols?" I asked. "How might better delegation affect your workload? What would it look like if everyone understood their priorities?" Something remarkable happened. Wheeler began generating the same solutions I had been trying to recommend, but now they were his ideas. He became enthusiastic about implementing changes that he had previously resisted when I suggested them directly. The difference was profound. When I told him what to do, he resisted. When he arrived at the conclusions himself, he embraced them completely. This experience taught me a fundamental truth about human psychology. People support what they help create. When someone reaches a conclusion through their own thinking process, they feel ownership of that idea. When the same conclusion is imposed from outside, they feel controlled and naturally resist. I began experimenting with this approach systematically. Instead of saying, "You should delegate more responsibilities," I would ask, "What tasks are you handling that someone else could manage with proper training?" Instead of declaring, "Your meetings are too long," I would inquire, "How do you feel about the length and effectiveness of your current meetings?" The results were consistently dramatic. People who had been defensive and resistant became thoughtful and engaged. They began proposing changes and solutions that went far beyond what I had originally suggested. More importantly, they implemented these solutions enthusiastically because they felt ownership of them. I learned that questions have a unique psychological power. They engage people's minds in a way that statements cannot. A statement can be ignored, argued with, or passively accepted. A question demands mental participation. It requires the listener to think, evaluate, and form opinions. But not all questions are equally effective. I discovered that the most motivational questions are those that help people recognize problems they need to solve or opportunities they want to pursue. What's working well in your current approach is a good question. What challenges are you facing with your current approach is even better because it helps people identify their own motivation for change. I also learned the importance of asking questions that assume positive capability rather than highlighting deficiencies. Instead of, "Why are you having trouble with time management?" I would ask, "What strategies have you found most effective for managing your time?" This approach helps people build on their strengths rather than dwelling on their weaknesses. One of my most successful applications of this principle involved a department that was struggling with productivity. The manager, Janet Morrison, had been issuing increasingly strict rules and directives, but performance continued to decline. The team seemed demoralized and resistant to any changes. I suggested that Janet try a different approach. Instead of announcing new policies, she would meet with her team and ask for their input. What obstacles are preventing you from doing your best work? What changes would help you be more effective? How could we improve our processes? The team's response surprised everyone, including Janet. They identified problems that management hadn't recognized and proposed solutions that were more creative and practical than anything the leadership team had considered. More importantly, because these ideas came from the team itself, implementation was smooth and enthusiastic. One employee later told me it was the first time anyone asked what we thought instead of just telling us what to do. It made us feel like our experience and ideas mattered. This taught me that asking questions instead of giving orders accomplishes several important things simultaneously. First, it shows respect for the other person's intelligence and judgment. Second, it engages their problem-solving abilities. Third, it creates ownership of the resulting decisions. Fourth, it often produces better solutions because the people closest to the situation usually understand it best. The technique works in every relationship, with employees, children, spouses, and friends. Instead of demanding compliance, you invite participation. Instead of creating resistance, you generate enthusiasm. Instead of making people feel controlled, you help them feel empowered. The art lies in asking the right questions in the right way, with genuine curiosity about the other person's perspective, rather than as a manipulative technique to lead them toward predetermined conclusions. The most motivated people I ever encountered weren't driven by money, fear, or external pressure. They were inspired by a vision of something better, a future they wanted to help create. Learning to paint such visions became one of my most powerful tools for generating genuine enthusiasm in others. This insight crystallized during my work with a struggling department store in Philadelphia. The store was losing customers to newer competitors, employee morale was low, and the owner, Margaret Chen, was considering closing permanently. When I first met with the staff, they seemed defeated and disengaged. They were going through the motions of their jobs while mentally preparing for unemployment. Margaret had been trying to motivate her employees through a combination of threats about job security and promises of small bonuses for improved performance. Neither approach was working. The threats increased anxiety without improving performance, and the bonus promises felt hollow. Given the store's obvious financial struggles, I suggested a completely different approach. Instead of focusing on problems and consequences, we would focus on possibilities and potential. Margaret was skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything. We called a staff meeting and began not by discussing what was wrong, but by exploring what could be right. Imagine, I said to the assembled employees, that this store becomes the most beloved shopping destination in the neighborhood. What would that look like? How would customers feel when they walked through these doors? What kind of experience would they have? At first, people were hesitant to engage. Years of focusing on problems had made them cautious about expressing hopes. But gradually, they began to share ideas. Sarah, a sales clerk, talked about customers feeling welcomed and valued rather than pressured. Tom from the stockroom described a store where people could find unique items they couldn't get elsewhere. Linda, a seamstress, envisioned offering custom alteration services that would make every customer look their best. As they talked, something remarkable happened. Their energy shifted. Eyes that had been dull with resignation began to sparkle with possibility. Voices that had been flat with despair became animated with enthusiasm. They weren't just describing a store anymore. They were creating a vision of something they wanted to be part of. Margaret wisely encouraged this conversation, asking questions that helped expand and refine their shared vision. What would make customers feel most welcomed? How could we create an experience that people would recommend to their friends? What unique services could we offer that larger stores couldn't match? Over the following weeks, something extraordinary occurred. Without being assigned specific tasks or given detailed instructions, employees began taking initiative to move toward the vision they had helped create. Sarah started greeting every customer personally and remembering regular shoppers' preferences. Tom reorganized the stockroom and began suggesting unique items to order. Linda offered to start the custom alteration service they had discussed. Transformation wasn't immediate, but it was genuine and sustainable. Employee absenteeism dropped dramatically. Customer complaints decreased while compliments increased. Most importantly, people came to work with energy and purpose because they were working toward something they believed in. The key insight was that people need something bigger than themselves to feel truly motivated. When work becomes just about earning a paycheck or avoiding punishment, it feels meaningless. But when work becomes about creating something valuable, solving important problems, or contributing to a worthy cause, it becomes energizing. I learned that effective vision painting requires several elements. First, the vision must be genuinely inspiring. It should describe a future that people actually want to help create. Second, it must be concrete enough that people can picture it clearly and understand their role in achieving it. Third, it must be collaborative. People need to help shape the vision, not just receive it from above. I also discovered that the most powerful visions connect individual work to broader purpose. People want to feel that their efforts matter, that they're contributing to something meaningful beyond their immediate tasks. When you can help someone see how their daily work contributes to a larger vision they care about, motivation becomes self-sustaining. This principle works in every context. Business teams working toward market leadership, families working toward shared goals, community groups working toward neighborhood improvement, or individuals working toward personal dreams. The common element is always the same. People become enthusiastic when they can see themselves as part of creating something worthwhile. The art lies in discovering what kind of future genuinely inspires the people you're working with, then helping them see how their actions can help bring that future into reality. When people feel they're building something meaningful rather than just completing tasks, their entire approach to work transforms. Vision creates enthusiasm because it gives people something to move toward rather than just something to move away from. It transforms work from obligation into opportunity. Most people approach persuasion like a battle. They present their position forcefully and then fight to defend it against all objections. I learned this approach almost always fails because it triggers the natural human tendency to resist being conquered. True persuasion, I discovered, works more like a dance than a battle. This revelation came through a particularly challenging situation with a school board that was considering eliminating funding for adult education programs. I had been invited to speak on behalf of continuing these programs, and my initial instinct was to build an overwhelming case for why the board was wrong to consider cuts. I prepared extensively, gathering statistics about the economic benefits of adult education, testimonials from successful students, and expert opinions on the importance of lifelong learning. I was ready to demolish any argument against the programs, But something made me pause before the meeting. I realized I was approaching this as if the board members were opponents to be defeated, rather than people facing a difficult decision. They weren't eliminating programs because they opposed education. They were facing genuine budget constraints and trying to make impossible choices about priorities. I completely changed my approach. Instead of attacking their position, I began by acknowledging the difficulty of their situation. "I know you're facing extremely tough budget decisions," I said. "Every program you consider cutting serves important needs, and there's no easy way to balance competing priorities with limited resources." The board members visibly relaxed. They had been prepared for confrontation, but instead found understanding. Then, instead of arguing why they were wrong, I asked questions that helped them think through the implications of different choices. What concerns you most about the budget situation? How do you evaluate the long-term impact of various programs? What criteria are you using to make these difficult decisions? As they talked, I listened carefully, not just to their words, but to their underlying concerns and values. They were worried about immediate budget pressures, but they also cared deeply about serving their community effectively. They weren't opponents of education. They were stewards trying to be responsible with public resources. Only then did I begin presenting information, but I framed it in terms of their concerns rather than my agenda. Instead of lecturing them about the importance of adult education, I shared data about how these programs actually saved money by reducing the need for other social services. Instead of pressuring them to maintain funding, I helped them see how the programs aligned with their own stated priorities. The result was remarkable. What could have been a contentious debate became a collaborative problem-solving session. The board didn't just vote to maintain funding, they actually increased it because they became convinced that adult education was an investment rather than an expense. This experience taught me the fundamental principle of gentle persuasion. You must start where people are, not where you want them to be. Fighting someone's current position head-on only strengthens their resistance. But when you begin by understanding and acknowledging their perspective, you create space for new ideas to take root. I learned that the most effective persuasion follows a specific sequence. First, establish genuine understanding of the other person's viewpoint. Second, find authentic common ground between their position and yours. Third, build on that common ground to introduce new perspectives gradually. Fourth, help them reach new conclusions through their own thinking process rather than trying to impose your conclusions on them. The key insight is that people don't resist ideas that feel like natural extensions of their existing beliefs. They resist ideas that feel like attacks on their current thinking. When you can help someone see how a new perspective connects to what they already believe, they're much more likely to embrace it. I also discovered the power of allowing people to save face when changing their minds. Instead of making them admit they were wrong, you help them see new information that justifies a different conclusion. This makes change feel like growth rather than defeat. One of my most successful applications of this principle involved two business partners who were locked in a bitter dispute about company direction. Each was convinced the other was making terrible decisions that would ruin their business. Traditional mediation had failed because each meeting became a battle where both sides presented their positions more forcefully. I suggested a different approach. Instead of defending their positions, each partner would spend time trying to understand and articulate the other's concerns. Only after demonstrating this understanding would they be allowed to present their own perspective. The result was transformational. When each partner truly understood the other's concerns, they discovered that their core goals were actually the same. They both wanted the business to succeed and grow. Their disagreement wasn't about objectives, but about the best methods to achieve shared goals. Once they established this common ground, finding compromise solutions became relatively easy. They weren't trying to defeat each other anymore. They were collaborating to find approaches that addressed both of their legitimate concerns. Gentle Persuasion works because it respects people's intelligence and autonomy while providing them with new information and perspectives to consider. It creates willing converts rather than resentful captives. The most profound discovery of my career was realizing that the most powerful motivation comes from within people themselves, not from external rewards or punishments. When you can't help someone connect with their internal drive, you unlock a source of energy and commitment that no external force can match. This insight emerged through my work with a young woman named Dorothy Richardson, who worked as a clerk in a law firm. Dorothy's supervisor, Mr. Williams, had asked me to help improve her performance. She was capable but seemed chronically unmotivated, doing only the minimum required and showing no initiative or enthusiasm. Mr. Williams had tried the usual approaches: offers of small raises for better performance, warnings about consequences for continued mediocrity, and detailed instructions about how to improve her work. Nothing had made any lasting difference. When I met with Dorothy, I expected to find someone who was lazy or indifferent. Instead, I discovered someone who felt trapped and unfulfilled. She had originally taken the job as a temporary measure while pursuing her real interest in writing, but temporary had become permanent, and she felt stuck in work that held no meaning for her. Rather than trying to motivate her to be a better clerk, I asked about her writing aspirations. Her entire demeanor changed as she described the stories she wanted to tell and the impact she hoped her writing might have on readers. She spoke with passion and energy that was completely absent when discussing her office duties. Then I asked a question that changed everything. How could your current job help you become a better writer? At first, Dorothy couldn't see any connection, but as we explored the question together, she began to recognize opportunities. The legal documents she processed were teaching her about clear, precise communication. The client interactions were helping her understand different types of people and their motivations. The organizational systems she used could inform how she structured her own writing projects. Most importantly, the steady income from her job was providing the financial security that allowed her to write without the pressure of immediate financial return. Instead of seeing her job as an obstacle to her writing career, she began to view it as a foundation that supported her real passion. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Dorothy began approaching her work with new energy because she understood how it connected to her larger goals. She took initiative in organizing office systems because she was practicing skills she would need as a professional writer. She engaged more thoughtfully with clients because she was studying human nature for her stories. Within 6 months, Dorothy had become one of the firm's most valuable employees. But more importantly, she had also completed her first published story and was making steady progress toward her writing goals. Her supervisor was amazed by the change, but Dorothy later told me, "I didn't change what I was doing. I changed why I was doing it." This experience taught me that intrinsic motivation has 3 essential components: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. People need to feel some degree of control over their work, opportunities to develop and improve their skills, and connection to something meaningful beyond immediate tasks. Autonomy doesn't mean complete freedom. It means having some choice in how you approach your responsibilities. Even within structured environments, there are usually opportunities for people to express their individuality and make decisions about methods and approaches. Mastery involves the deep satisfaction that comes from getting better at something that matters to you. People are naturally motivated to improve skills they value, but they need opportunities to see their progress and take on appropriate challenges that stretch their abilities. Purpose connects daily work to larger meaning. When people understand how their efforts contribute to something they care about, whether that's serving customers, supporting family, developing personally, or making a difference in the world, their work becomes energizing rather than draining. Learned that building intrinsic motivation requires understanding what each person genuinely cares about. then helping them see authentic connections between their current situation and their deeper values and aspirations. This isn't about manipulation or creating false connections. It's about helping people recognize connections that already exist but may not be obvious. The approach works equally well with children, employees, students, and even yourself. A child who resists practicing piano might become enthusiastic when they understand how music skills connect to their dream of performing. An employee who seems unmotivated might engage differently when they see how their role contributes to outcomes they value. I also discovered that intrinsic motivation is more sustainable than external motivation. People who are driven by internal satisfaction continue their efforts even when external rewards are removed or external pressure is absent. They work hard because the work itself feels meaningful and rewarding. The art lies in helping people discover their own reasons for caring about what they're doing, rather than trying to impose external reasons for caring. When someone finds their internal motivation, they become self-directed and self-sustaining. They don't need constant supervision or encouragement because their drive comes from within. This doesn't mean external factors don't matter. Fair compensation, recognition, and good working conditions are important. But these external factors support intrinsic motivation rather than replacing it. When people care deeply about their work for internal reasons, external rewards feel like appreciation rather than manipulation. Nothing revealed the difference between motivation and manipulation more clearly than observing how people responded to praise versus criticism. Most people, including myself in my early years, instinctively used criticism to try to improve performance. I learned this approach almost always backfires, while genuine praise has the power to transform both behavior and self-concept. The lesson began with a painful personal experience. During my early teaching days, I worked with a student named James Murphy who struggled with public speaking. James was intelligent and articulate in private conversation, but became tongue-tied and nervous when speaking to groups. My initial approach was to point out everything he was doing wrong. "James, you're speaking too quietly," I would say. "You're not making eye contact. Your posture shows a lack of confidence. You need to eliminate those filler words." I thought detailed criticism would help him identify and correct his problems. The result was exactly the opposite of what I intended. With each criticism, James became more self-conscious and nervous. He began focusing so intently on avoiding mistakes that he lost all naturalness and spontaneity. His speaking actually got worse, not better, despite my well-intentioned feedback. Then I observed something interesting. During a class break, James was telling another student about his weekend fishing trip. He spoke with animation, confidence, and natural eloquence. His voice was strong, his gestures were appropriate, and he held his listeners' complete attention. He was doing everything right that he struggled with during formal presentations. This observation changed my entire approach. Instead of focusing on what James was doing wrong during presentations, I began acknowledging what he was doing right in natural conversation. "James, I noticed how effectively you told that fishing story," I said. "Your voice was strong and clear, and you painted such vivid pictures that I felt like I was there with you." I saw immediate changes in his posture and expression. Where criticism had made him withdraw, specific praise made him stand taller and smile with genuine pleasure. I began applying this approach systematically. Instead of pointing out problems during his presentations, I would find specific things he did well and acknowledge them explicitly. "James, your opening story captured everyone's attention immediately. Your passion for the topic really came through in that section. I noticed how you connected with Mary when you answered her question. The transformation was remarkable." As James received specific recognition for his strengths, he began building on them naturally. His confidence grew, and ironically, the problems I had been criticizing began disappearing on their own. When someone feels good about their abilities, they tend to use those abilities more effectively. This experience taught me a fundamental principle. People tend to become what you tell them they are. When you consistently point out someone's weaknesses, they begin to see themselves as weak in those areas and often fulfill that expectation. But when you recognize and acknowledge their strengths, they begin to see themselves as capable and tend to live up to that higher expectation. I learned that effective praise requires several key elements. First, it must be specific rather than general. Good job means little, but your clear explanation of that complex concept helped everyone understand it, shows that you actually noticed and valued something specific. Second, praise must be genuine. People can sense the difference between authentic appreciation and empty flattery immediately. Genuine praise acknowledges something that actually happened and actually mattered. Third, effective praise focuses on effort and improvement rather than just natural talent. Saying you're naturally good at this can actually undermine motivation because it suggests success comes from fixed ability rather than effort. But saying your hard work on improving your presentation skills really shows reinforces the connection between effort and improvement. I also discovered the power of praising people's character and potential rather than just their performance. When you tell someone you're the kind of person who really cares about quality, you're helping them see themselves as someone who values excellence. This type of identity-based praise often influences behavior more powerfully than task-specific feedback. When criticism is necessary, I learned to frame it in terms of the gap between someone's usual high standards and their current performance. Instead of saying, "This work is sloppy," I would say, "This doesn't seem to reflect the careful attention to detail you usually bring to your projects. What might help you bring your usual thoroughness to this task?" This approach assumes competence rather than incompetence and invites problem-solving rather than defending. It preserves the person's self-respect while still addressing the need for improvement. The most powerful discovery was that praise has a multiplying effect. When you genuinely acknowledge someone's strengths and efforts, they not only improve in those areas, but often begin improving in areas you haven't even mentioned. Confidence and motivation tend to spill over from one area of life to others. People are naturally motivated to live up to positive expectations, especially when those expectations are expressed through specific, genuine recognition of their efforts and achievements. Of all the motivational tools I discovered, none proved more powerful than storytelling. Facts might inform people, arguments might convince them, but stories inspire them to action. A well-told story can accomplish in minutes what hours of logical persuasion cannot achieve. This revelation came during one of my most challenging assignments, helping a struggling insurance company motivate its sales force. The agents were demoralized by constant rejection and seemed to have lost faith in the value of what they were selling. Traditional training focused on product features, sales techniques, and closing strategies. But none of these approaches were generating the enthusiasm needed for success. During my first meeting with the sales team, I could see the resignation in their faces. They sat through my presentation politely, but without engagement. When I asked about their biggest challenges, the responses were telling. People don't want to think about death. Insurance feels like a waste of money to most people. Nobody wants to buy what we're selling. Instead of launching into arguments about why they were wrong, I told them a story. "Let me tell you about a man named William Henderson," I began. William was a carpenter in Pittsburgh with a wife and 3 young children. He came home from work one evening and found an insurance salesman sitting in his kitchen talking with his wife about a life insurance policy. William was tired, irritated, and wanted the man to leave. "We can't afford insurance," William told the salesman. "We're barely making ends meet as it is. I'm healthy and strong, and we need every dollar for food and rent," the salesman persisted. Gently and eventually, William bought a small policy, mainly to get the man out of his house. 6 months later, William fell from a scaffold at a construction site and died instantly. His widow, Mary, was devastated by grief and terrified about how she would support 3 children on her own. Then she remembered the insurance policy. That small monthly premium that had seemed like such a burden became a lifeline that allowed her to keep her home, feed her children, and even send them to school. 20 years later, Mary's eldest son graduated from college and became a teacher. At the graduation ceremony, he publicly thanked his father for having the wisdom to buy life insurance. Because of that policy, he said, my mother didn't have to send us to work in factories as children. We could get an education and build a better lives. I watched the transformation in the room as I told this story. The agents sat up straighter. Their expressions changed from resignation to attention, and several nodded in recognition. When I finished, one agent said quietly, I never thought about it that way. We're not selling policies, we're selling security and opportunity. That simple story accomplished what no amount of product training or sales technique instruction could achieve. It helped the agents see the deeper meaning and value in their work. They weren't bothering people with unwanted products. They were offering protection and peace of mind to families who needed it. The results were immediate and lasting. Sales increased dramatically, but more importantly, the agents approached their work with renewed purpose and enthusiasm. They had connected with the human impact of what they were doing. This experience taught me that stories work because they engage both emotion and imagination in ways that facts and arguments cannot. When you tell someone a statistic, they might remember it. When you tell them a story, they experience it. I learned that the most motivational stories share certain characteristics. They feature real people facing recognizable challenges. They show the consequences of action or inaction in human terms. They help listeners see themselves in similar situations. And they demonstrate the positive impact that can result from the action you're hoping to inspire. The key is authenticity. The most powerful stories are true stories about real people and real consequences. When people know that what you're describing actually happened, it carries weight that fictional examples cannot match. I also discovered that personal stories often have the greatest impact. When you share your own experiences, your failures, as well as your successes, people connect with your humanity and are more likely to trust your message. But the story must serve the listener, not just the storyteller. The most effective motivational stories help people see new possibilities for themselves rather than just highlighting your own achievements. I began collecting stories from every area of life: business successes, personal transformations, community improvements, family triumphs, and individual breakthroughs. I found that the right story at the right moment could shift someone's entire perspective and unlock motivation that had been dormant. Stories work because they bypass intellectual resistance and speak directly to our emotions and values. When someone argues with you about facts, they can maintain emotional distance. But when they become absorbed in a story, they temporarily set aside their defenses and allow themselves to be influenced. The art lies in choosing stories that resonate with your audience's experiences and aspirations, then telling them in ways that help people see connections to their own situations. When someone sees themselves in your story, they begin to imagine different possibilities for their own life. The most humbling lesson of my career came when I realized that people were watching my actions far more closely than they were listening to my words. No amount of eloquent speaking about motivation could overcome the demotivating effect of hypocritical behavior. Authentic leadership, I discovered, flows from the consistency between what you teach and how you live. This painful truth became clear during a particularly challenging period in my own life. I was conducting seminars about positive thinking and human relations while privately struggling with financial stress and personal doubts. I thought I was hiding my struggles well, maintaining a confident facade during my presentations, but people could sense something was off. My teachings felt less compelling, my enthusiasm seemed forced, and my influence with audiences noticeably diminished. Students still attended my classes and nodded politely, but the transformational results I had come to expect were simply not happening. The breakthrough came through a conversation with one of my longtime students, a businessman named Frank Morrison, who had attended multiple courses over several years. Frank approached me after a particularly lackluster session and said something that stopped me cold. "Dale," he said gently, "I've learned tremendous things from you over the years, but lately something feels different. You're teaching the same principles, but they don't seem to be working the same way in your own life. It's affecting how I receive what you're saying." I was initially defensive, but Frank's observation was both accurate and delivered with genuine care rather than criticism. He had noticed the disconnect between my teachings and my current state of mind, and this disconnect was undermining my ability to inspire others. That conversation forced me to confront a fundamental truth. You cannot give what you do not have. If I wanted to inspire confidence in others, I needed to cultivate genuine confidence in myself. If I wanted to teach optimism, I needed to practice it authentically, especially during difficult times. I began applying my own principles more deliberately to my personal challenges. Instead of just teaching about positive thinking, I practiced it rigorously when facing my financial difficulties. Instead of just instructing others about human relations, I focused on improving my relationships with family and colleagues. Instead of just speaking about persistence, I demonstrated it by working through my own setbacks. The change was remarkable, both in my personal life and in my professional effectiveness. As I became more authentic in living my principles, my teaching became more powerful. Students sensed the difference immediately. My words carried more weight because they emerged from genuine experience rather than theoretical knowledge. This experience taught me that authentic leadership is fundamentally about integrity, the alignment between values, words, and actions. People can sense this alignment or the lack of it almost instantly, even when they can't articulate what they're perceiving. I learned that leading by example doesn't mean being perfect. In fact, some of my most powerful teaching moments came from sharing my struggles and how I was applying my principles to overcome them. People connect more deeply with someone who is genuinely working to improve than with someone who pretends to have already arrived. The key insight was that people don't just learn from what you tell them, they learn from who you are and how you handle challenges. Your daily behavior teaches more powerfully than your most eloquent speeches. I began paying much closer attention to the consistency between my teachings and my actions. When I taught about the importance of appreciating others, I made sure I was genuinely practicing appreciation in my own relationships. When I spoke about the value of continuous learning, I ensured I was actively learning and growing myself. This principle extended to every aspect of leadership. If you want to motivate punctuality, you must be consistently on time. If you want to inspire quality work, your own work must reflect high standards. If you want to encourage positive attitudes, you must maintain genuine optimism even during difficult periods. I discovered that leading by example is particularly powerful because it provides proof that your principles actually work. When people see you successfully applying the concepts you teach, they gain confidence that these concepts can work for them too. But the opposite is equally true. When your actions contradict your words, people lose faith not just in you, but in the principles themselves. Hypocrisy doesn't just undermine your credibility, it undermines the very ideas you're trying to promote. One of the most important aspects of leading by example is how you handle mistakes and setbacks. People are watching to see whether you practice what you preach when things go wrong. Do you blame others or take responsibility? Do you become defensive or use setbacks as learning opportunities? Do you maintain your principles under pressure or abandon them when they become inconvenient? I learned that authenticity in leadership means being willing to admit when you're struggling while demonstrating your commitment to applying your principles to work through those struggles. This vulnerability doesn't weaken your influence, it strengthens it by making your leadership more human and relatable. Leading by example ultimately means recognizing that you are always teaching, whether you intend to or not. Every interaction, every decision, every response to pressure is communicating something about your values and the effectiveness of your principles. The question isn't whether you're setting an example, it's whether the example you're setting is inspiring others to become their best selves. One of the most persistent challenges I encountered was helping people overcome their natural resistance to change, even when that change would clearly benefit them. I learned that this resistance isn't usually about logic or stubbornness. It's about fundamental human psychology and the deep need for security and control. The insight crystallized while working with a manufacturing company that needed to implement new production methods to remain competitive. The changes were necessary for the company's survival, would make jobs easier and safer, and could potentially lead to better wages. Yet the workers resisted the new methods fiercely, clinging to familiar routines even when those routines were more difficult and less effective. Management was frustrated and bewildered. "Why won't they embrace changes that will help them?" the plant manager asked me. "Are they just being stubborn?" I spent time talking with individual workers to understand their perspective. What I discovered surprised me. The resistance wasn't really about the changes themselves. It was about the fear and uncertainty that change represented. Even positive change feels threatening when people don't understand it, don't feel control over it, or fear they won't be able to adapt successfully. One veteran worker, Samuel, explained it perfectly. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know I'm good at it. Now they want to change everything, and I'm scared I won't be able to learn the new way. What if I can't keep up? What if they decide I'm too old to adapt?" At least with the old system, I knew where I stood. This conversation helped me understand that resistance to change is often resistance to feeling incompetent, insecure, or out of control. People need to feel that they can successfully navigate change before they'll embrace it willingly. I developed an approach that addressed these underlying fears rather than fighting the resistance directly. Instead of pushing harder for the changes, we focused on making change feel safer and more manageable. First, we involved the workers in understanding why the changes were necessary. Instead of simply announcing new procedures, we helped them see the problems with current methods and participate in exploring solutions. When people understand the reasons for change and feel involved in shaping it, resistance decreases dramatically. Second, we broke the changes into smaller, manageable steps rather than implementing everything at once. Large changes feel overwhelming, but small changes feel achievable. Each successful small change builds confidence for the next step. Third, we provided extensive training and support to ensure people felt competent with new methods before fully implementing them. Fear of failure is one of the strongest sources of resistance, so addressing this fear directly makes change much easier to accept. Fourth, we acknowledged people's expertise with existing methods while helping them see how that expertise could transfer to new approaches. Instead of making people feel that their experience was worthless, we showed them how their knowledge formed a foundation for learning new skills. The transformation was remarkable. Workers who had been actively resistant became enthusiastic advocates for the changes. More importantly, they began suggesting additional improvements and innovations once they felt secure with the basic changes. This experience taught me that overcoming resistance to change requires addressing the emotional and psychological aspects of change, not just the logical ones. People need to feel that change is safe, achievable, and respects their existing competence and contributions. Learn several key principles for helping people embrace change willingly. First, timing matters enormously. People are most open to change when they recognize a genuine need for it. If you can help people see problems with current approaches before proposing solutions, they become much more receptive to new ideas. Second, involvement creates ownership. When people participate in designing change rather than having it imposed on them, they feel more control and become invested in making it successful. Third, small wins build momentum. Early successes with minor changes create confidence and enthusiasm for larger transformations. Fourth, support and training are essential. People need to feel capable of succeeding with new approaches before they'll abandon familiar ones. Fifth, respect for the past eases acceptance of the future. Acknowledging what has worked well in current methods makes people more willing to consider improvements. I also discovered that resistance often contains valuable information. When people object to proposed changes, their concerns frequently identify real problems that need to be addressed. Instead of dismissing resistance, I learned to explore it for insights that could improve the change process. The key insight was that people don't resist change itself. They resist loss of control, fear of failure, and feeling devalued. When you address these underlying concerns, resistance transforms into cooperation and often into genuine enthusiasm. This approach works in every context where change is needed: personal habits, family dynamics, organizational procedures, or community improvements. The principle remains the same: help people feel safe, capable, and valued throughout the change process, and resistance gives way to motivation. Perhaps the greatest challenge in motivation isn't creating initial enthusiasm, it's maintaining that enthusiasm over time. I learned this lesson through observing countless individuals who started projects with tremendous energy, only to see that energy fade as days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The pattern was heartbreakingly consistent. People would attend my seminars, read inspiring books, or make passionate commitments to change, and for a brief period they would be transformed. They would approach their work, relationships, and personal goals with renewed vigor and optimism. But gradually, inevitably, most would slip back into old patterns of thinking and behaving. This phenomenon troubled me deeply because I knew the principles I taught were sound. I had seen them work dramatically in countless situations. The problem wasn't with the principles themselves, but with how people tried to maintain them in the face of daily pressures and setbacks. The breakthrough came through studying individuals who did manage to sustain long-term motivation and positive change. What separated these people from those whose enthusiasm faded? What allowed them to maintain momentum when others lost it? I discovered that sustained motivation depends on several critical factors that most people overlook in their initial enthusiasm. First, successful people built systems and habits rather than relying on willpower and inspiration alone. They understood that motivation naturally fluctuates, so they created structures that supported their goals even during periods of low energy or enthusiasm. One of my most successful students, Robert Chen, explained this principle perfectly. Robert had transformed himself from a struggling salesman into one of his company's top performers. When I asked how he maintained his motivation through inevitable periods of rejection and difficulty, he said, "I learned that I can't depend on feeling motivated every day. Instead, I built routines that keep me moving toward my goals, whether I feel like it or not." Robert's approach included daily habits of reading inspirational material, reviewing his goals, and practicing key skills regardless of his mood or immediate results. These habits carried him through periods when his natural motivation was low, and they helped him rebuild enthusiasm when setbacks threatened to derail his progress. Second, people who sustained motivation understood the importance of measuring progress in small increments rather than waiting for dramatic results. They celebrated small wins and incremental improvements, which provided the encouragement needed to continue during long periods of gradual development. Third, they connected with others who shared similar goals and values. Isolation kills motivation, while supportive relationships sustain it. People need encouragement, accountability, and the inspiration that comes from seeing others successfully applying similar principles. Fourth, they regularly renewed their connection to their deeper purposes and values. Initial motivation often comes from excitement about new possibilities, but sustained motivation comes from ongoing connection to what truly matters to you. The most persistent people regularly reminded themselves why their goals were important and how achieving them would impact their lives and the lives of others they cared about. Fifth, they learned to reframe setbacks as learning opportunities rather than failures. Everyone faces obstacles and disappointments, but people who maintain long-term motivation view these experiences as information and education rather than evidence that they should give up. I also discovered the crucial importance of what I came to call motivation maintenance, deliberate activities designed to sustain enthusiasm over time. Just as physical health requires ongoing attention to diet and exercise, motivational health requires ongoing attention to inspiration and purpose. This might include regularly reading materials that reinforce your values and goals, spending time with people who inspire and challenge you, reflecting on progress you've made and lessons you've learned, or engaging in activities that reconnect you with your deeper purposes. One of the most powerful strategies I found was helping people create what I called motivation anchors, specific reminders of why their goals mattered and evidence of their ability to achieve them. These might be photos of family members they wanted to provide for, letters from people they had helped, records of past achievements, or visual representations of their aspirations. During difficult periods, these anchors served as tangible reminders of their motivation and capability, helping them persevere when immediate circumstances were discouraging. I learned that sustained motivation also requires flexibility and adaptability. People who try to maintain exactly the same level of enthusiasm and energy indefinitely, inevitably, burn out. Sustainable motivation involves accepting natural cycles of energy and adjusting expectations and activities accordingly. Finally, the most important insight was that motivation becomes self-renewing when you use it to help others. People who applied motivational principles only to their own goals eventually found their enthusiasm waning. But those who used their energy and insights to encourage and inspire others discovered that giving motivation away actually multiplied. When you help someone else overcome challenges or achieve goals, you remind yourself of the power of these principles and renew your own commitment to applying them. One of my most important discoveries was that there is no universal approach to motivation. What inspires one person might discourage another, and what energizes someone in one situation might drain them in different circumstances. Effective motivation requires understanding and adapting to individual differences in personality, values, and communication styles. This insight emerged through a frustrating experience with a diverse team of managers I was trying to help improve their leadership effectiveness. I used my standard approach, enthusiastic presentations about human relations principles, inspiring stories about transformation, and passionate appeals to their desire to make a difference. The results were puzzlingly inconsistent. Some managers embraced the concepts immediately and began implementing them with great success. Others seemed skeptical and reserved, asking detailed questions about evidence and methodology. Still others appeared interested, but struggled to translate the concepts into practical action. A few seemed overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the approach. I realized I was treating everyone the same way, assuming that what worked for me would work for everyone. This assumption was limiting my effectiveness and, more importantly, preventing some genuinely motivated people from getting the help they needed in a form they could use. I began studying the managers more carefully, observing how they naturally approached problems, made decisions, and interacted with others. Patterns emerged that helped me understand why my standard approach worked well for some people, but not for others. Some managers were naturally analytical and data-driven. They wanted to understand the research behind human relations principles before they would trust them. My emotional appeals and inspiring stories meant little to them without solid evidence and logical explanations. Other managers were highly people-focused and relationship-oriented. They responded enthusiastically to stories and emotional appeals, but sometimes struggled with the practical implementation of abstract concepts. They needed concrete tools and techniques they could use immediately in their daily interactions. Still others were action-oriented and results-focused. They appreciated the potential value of the principles, but wanted to know exactly how to apply them to achieve specific outcomes. They needed clear, step-by-step processes rather than philosophical discussions. Finally, some managers were naturally supportive and harmony-seeking. They loved the ideas about improving relationships and helping people, but they were uncomfortable with approaches that might create conflict or require them to be assertive. Once I recognized these different orientations, I began adapting my approach to match each person's natural style and preferences. For analytical personalities, I focused on the research and evidence supporting human relations principles. I presented case studies with specific data about improved performance, reduced turnover, and measurable outcomes. I helped them see motivation as a logical system with predictable cause and effect relationships. For people-oriented personalities, I emphasized the human impact of motivational leadership. I shared stories about transformed relationships and improved team dynamics. I helped them connect motivational principles to their natural desire to help and inspire others. For results-oriented personalities, I presented motivation as a tool for achieving better outcomes. I focused on specific techniques they could implement immediately and showed them how to measure the effectiveness of their efforts. I helped them see motivation as a means to accomplish their goals more efficiently. For harmony-seeking personalities, I emphasized collaborative approaches to motivation. I showed them how to inspire others without being pushy or confrontational. I helped them understand that gentle influence could be even more powerful than forceful persuasion. The transformation in my effectiveness was dramatic. Managers who had seemed resistant or confused began engaging enthusiastically when the material was presented in ways that matched their natural thinking and communication styles. This experience taught me that effective motivation requires flexibility and empathy. You must understand how different people process information, make decisions, and feel comfortable engaging with new ideas. I learned to look for clues about someone's personality and preferences before choosing my motivational approach. Do they ask for data and evidence, or do they respond to emotional appeals? Do they want detailed explanations, or do they prefer to jump into action? Do they thrive on challenge and competition, or do they prefer cooperation and support? The key insight was that people aren't resistant to motivation. They're resistant to approaches that don't match their natural style. When you adapt your method to their preferences, resistance often disappears and enthusiasm emerges. This principle applies beyond personality types to cultural differences, generational gaps, and individual life experiences. A young employee might respond to different motivational approaches than an experienced worker. Someone from a hierarchical culture might need different handling than someone from an egalitarian background. The art lies in observing carefully, listening actively, and adapting your approach based on what you learn about each individual. This doesn't mean changing your core principles. It means presenting those principles in ways that each person can most easily understand, accept, and apply. The most remarkable discovery of my career wasn't about how to motivate individuals. It was about what happens when motivated people begin motivating others. I witnessed something extraordinary. Genuine motivation spreads naturally from person to person, creating expanding circles of positive influence that can transform entire organizations and communities. This phenomenon first became clear to me while working with a struggling department store chain. The company had been losing market share for years, Employee morale was at an all-time low, and several locations were facing closure. Management had tried various approaches, new policies, restructuring, even threats, but nothing had improved the situation significantly. I began working with individual store managers, helping them apply motivational principles with their teams. My initial goal was modest: improve performance in a few key stores to demonstrate that positive change was possible. What happened exceeded my wildest expectations. Within 6 months, something remarkable had occurred in the stores where motivated managers were working. Not only had performance improved dramatically, but employees who had never attended any training sessions were beginning to apply similar principles with customers and coworkers. The positive changes were spreading organically throughout these locations. I watched Sarah, a sales clerk in one of these stores, naturally begin using appreciation and encouragement with her colleagues after experiencing this treatment from her newly motivated manager. Without any formal training, she had absorbed the principles simply by being on the receiving end of authentic motivation. James, a stockroom worker in another location, started taking initiative to help customers and train new employees after his supervisor began recognizing his contributions and asking for his input on improving procedures. He had become a motivator himself, inspiring others through his example and enthusiasm. The transformation wasn't limited to individual behavior. Entire store cultures were shifting. Employees who had been clock watchers became team players. Customer service improved dramatically. Sales increased not because of pressure or incentives, but because people genuinely cared about doing good work. Most significantly, these changes began spreading beyond the workplace. Employees carried their new attitudes and energy home to their families and out into their communities. Spouses noticed positive changes in their partners. Children benefited from parents who were more patient and encouraging. Community organizations found that these employees became more engaged volunteers and leaders. This experience taught me that motivation has a multiplication effect. When you genuinely motivate someone, you don't just change their behavior, you often awaken their natural desire to motivate others. People who feel valued and appreciated naturally want to create that same experience for those around them. The process is remarkably organic. You don't have to teach motivated people to motivate others. They do it instinctively because it feels good to give what they've received. When someone has experienced the power of genuine appreciation, they naturally want to appreciate others. When they've felt truly listened to, they become better listeners themselves. I began to see this pattern everywhere. A supervisor who learned to recognize his employees' contributions found that those employees began recognizing each other's efforts. A parent who started using encouragement instead of criticism discovered that their children became more encouraging with siblings and friends. A teacher who began focusing on students' strengths watched those students help and support their classmates more effectively. The multiplication effect works because motivation is contagious. Energy and enthusiasm spread naturally from person to person, just as negativity and discouragement do. But unlike artificial enthusiasm or forced positivity, genuine motivation based on authentic appreciation and respect has staying power and depth. I discovered that the most effective way to create this multiplication effect is to focus on developing people rather than just using them. When your motivation helps someone grow as a person, building their confidence, developing their skills, expanding their perspective, they become capable of helping others grow in similar ways. This requires a fundamental shift in thinking. Instead of seeing motivation as a tool to get what you want from people, you begin seeing it as a way to give people what they need to become their best selves. This approach takes longer to show results, but the results are deeper and more lasting. Learn that leaders who create multiplication effects share certain characteristics. They genuinely care about the growth and success of the people they work with. They see potential in others that those people might not see in themselves. They celebrate others' successes without feeling threatened. They create environments where people feel safe to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from both successes and failures. The most powerful realization was that this multiplication effect can extend far beyond your immediate sphere of influence. A single motivated person can eventually touch hundreds or thousands of lives, as their influence spreads through networks of relationships and interactions. I've seen store clerks whose positive attitudes influenced customers who then treated their own employees better. I've witnessed teachers whose encouragement of students created ripple effects that reached families and future classrooms. I've observed business leaders whose authentic motivation of their teams created organizational cultures that influenced entire industries. The multiplication effect reminds us that motivation is never just about individual performance. It's about creating positive change that extends far beyond what we can directly control or measure. When you help someone discover their own capacity to motivate and inspire others, you become part of something much larger than any single achievement or goal. As I reflect on a lifetime spent studying and teaching the principles of human motivation, I'm struck by how simple these concepts are at their core, yet how profound their impact can be when applied with genuine care and consistency. Throughout my career, I've seen ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things when they discovered their own capacity for growth and contribution. I've witnessed struggling relationships transform into sources of mutual support and inspiration. I've observed failing organizations become thriving communities where people eagerly contribute their best efforts. But I've also seen these same principles misused by those who sought to manipulate rather than motivate, to control rather than inspire. This distinction between motivation and manipulation remains as crucial today as it was when I first began this work. The difference isn't in the techniques themselves, but in the spirit behind their application. When you use these principles to help others achieve their own goals and realize their own potential, you create genuine motivation that lifts everyone involved. When you use them merely to get what you want from others, you create temporary compliance that ultimately breeds resentment and resistance. The responsibility that comes with understanding human motivation is significant. These principles work. They have the power to influence thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in profound ways. How you choose to use this influence will determine whether you become a positive force in the lives of others or merely another source of pressure and manipulation. I want to share with you my deepest hope for how these ideas will be used. I hope you will see them not as tools for getting your way, but as opportunities to help others discover their own strength, capability, and worth. I hope you will use them to build people up rather than wear them down, to inspire confidence rather than create dependence, to develop others' potential rather than exploit their vulnerabilities. The world has enough people trying to use and manipulate others for personal gain. What it desperately needs is more people committed to helping others grow, succeed, and find meaning in their contributions. When you motivate someone authentically, you give them something they can carry forward into every area of their life. Remember that the most powerful motivation comes from within people themselves. Your role isn't to create motivation where none exists. It's to recognize, nurture, and channel the motivation that's already there. Every person you encounter has dreams, desires, values, and aspirations. Your opportunity is to help them connect those internal drives with positive action. Be patient with both yourself and others as you apply these principles. Motivation isn't a magic formula that transforms people overnight. It's an ongoing process of understanding, encouraging, and supporting others in their growth and development. Some of your efforts will yield immediate results. Others will plant seeds that may not bloom for years. Pay attention to the multiplication effect of your motivational efforts. When you genuinely inspire someone, you often set in motion a chain of positive influence that extends far beyond what you can see or measure. The person you encourage today may encourage dozens of others tomorrow. The employee you develop may become a leader who develops hundreds of others. The child you believe in may grow up to inspire thousands. Finally, remember to apply these principles to yourself as well as others. You cannot give what you do not have. If you want to motivate others effectively, you must stay connected to your own sources of motivation and meaning. Take care of yourself, continue growing and learning, and maintain your own enthusiasm for the work you're doing. The principles I've shared with you are not just theories or techniques, they are a way of seeing and treating other human beings. They reflect a fundamental belief in the potential and worth of every person you meet. When you consistently apply this belief through your words and actions, you become part of something larger than yourself, a movement of people committed to bringing out the best in others. This is my legacy and my challenge to you. Use what you've learned to help others discover their own capacity for greatness. Motivate without manipulating. Inspire without exploiting. Build others up, and in doing so, you'll discover that your own life becomes richer, more meaningful, and more fulfilling than you ever imagined possible. The choice is yours. Will you use these principles to get more from others or to give more to others? Will you seek to control or to inspire? Will you manipulate or will you motivate? I trust you will choose the path of authentic motivation, for in helping others become their best selves, you become your best self as well.